Was the Wild West really as lawless and wild as the movies make it look? We hear about gunfights, train robberies, shootout. It sounds like a fun time unless you had to live through it. As it turns out, the West was pretty wild, just not in the way you might think. When people hear the phrase Wild West, they imagine all sorts of lawless behavior. And the reason for that is because the law in the West was few and far between. The sheriff and his deputies, classic characters in stories about the Old West. But most of them didn't wear white hats and protect small towns from outlaws. In fact, if there was law enforcement in a town at all, people were lucky if they weren't corrupt. Organized police forces are a pretty new thing in the United States. For most of U.S. history, individuals and towns had to take justice into their own hands. This goes back to how the law was enforced in Europe, which is where many Western settlers came from. For a big part of history, what we call police officers and detectives didn't really exist. If there was any law enforcement at all, it was handled by the military. Otherwise, it was the village elders, religious leaders, and politicians responsible for dispensing justice. For example, in England in the 1400s, people called watchmen patrolled the streets. They were responsible for arresting suspected criminals and drunks. Watchmen worked on a volunteer basis and weren't paid. Watchmen answered to constables chosen by town council. Constables arrested the more serious criminals, and they doubled as tax collectors. That made them pretty unpopular. It also meant that they were ripe for corruption. In most cases, the victim of a crime had to round up a posse and find the criminal themselves. This led to a lot of vigilante justice. If the victim of the theft was wealthy enough, he could hire the thief catchers. These were professional vigilantes who would hunt down criminals and retrieve stolen goods. They charged a percentage of the value of recovered property. Like constables, thief catchers were potentially very corrupt. It wasn't unusual for thieves to double as thief catchers. They would find the property they themselves had stolen, then collect a bounty off of it. At the same time, England was also hiring privateers. These were professional pirates who worked for the government. Privateers could legally attack foreign ships that drifted into English waters. Then they seized any valuables on board and split them with the government of England. This was the type of law enforcement America's founders had in mind when writing the Constitution. In their minds, a lack of organization was safer than too much organization. They were afraid that if an armed group got too much power, the U.S. could end up as a police state. This takes us back to the Wild West. After the Civil War, not much had changed in U.S. law enforcement from the country's earliest days. At least, not out west. Developed cities sometimes had police forces, but not out west. Law enforcement was mostly up to local citizens. If there were sheriffs or deputies, they were chosen by the town people themselves. This meant anyone could become a sheriff overnight, regardless of experience. This led to lots of corruption throughout the West. Sheriffs could be bribed by politicians, companies, and even outlaws. Many sheriffs used their new positions to settle old scores or make themselves rich. Enforcing the law came in a distant second place. The same went for judges. Becoming a judge out west was a license to practice the law as you saw fit. There was basically no government oversight. A judge really could be the jury and executioner too. As businesses began expanding west, they realized corrupt officials were endangering their interests. Corporations started hiring private securities to protect railroads, mines, and other investments. The lack of oversight in the Wild West also allowed businesses to get their own justice. Private companies could more quickly and easily spend money than the government. That meant they could offer higher rewards for wanted criminals. They could also name their own terms. That's where wanted dead or alive comes from. In the case of stolen goods, many businesses offered a reward based on the value of the missing property. This led to some corruption, like what happened back in England. The reward for stolen property was usually more than the reward for capturing the thieves who took it. So bounty hunters would often track down the robbers, take back the stolen goods, and let the robbers go. In some cases, they might even split the take with the robbers. The outlaws could then go on and commit another robbery. Then the bounty hunter would find it, collect the reward, and the cycle continued. That's one of the things that most Western movies get wrong. In movies, the local sheriff is the hero and he battles the lawless criminals and outlaws. In reality, the criminals and the law weren't that far apart. So what changed? We don't have a lawless frontier anymore. But why did it go away? Well, it was the march of time and progress that tamed the Wild West. As more people went west, they brought a higher need for more safety and structure. Slowly but surely, the West began to organize. Frontier communities began to organize city councils, police forces, and court systems. Little by little, the corrupt law enforcers and hanging judges of the Old West were forced out. A growing legal system created created rules that everyone had to abide by. That's when lawyers like me headed west to bring law to the lawless country. Today, the West has laws just like the rest of the country. Sure, there are places in states like Texas where it still feels a little like the Wild West, but along with all the cowboy hats and guns down there, you'll also find laws and rules. Thankfully, the vigilante posse of the Old West can only be found in the movies today. So remember, if you need justice, don't take it into your own hands. You know who to call. Call the Hammer. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.